This session, we are going to be talking about cross-examination. But before we jump in, as usual, we want to make sure, do you have any questions that you've come up with that we can address for you right now? Okay? All right, so somebody remind me, what is cross-examination? Cross-examination is a period within the debate where after somebody gives a speech, a representative from the other team gets to stand up and ask questions about that speech. Okay? Where does cross-examination happen in the debate round? There are 4 periods of cross-examination, one after each constructive speech. Okay? Now, a lot of debaters, when they're first starting out, go into cross-examination not really understanding its importance. They view cross-examination as just another source of prep time, just something that they have to do, okay? But cross-examination has a huge strategic benefit to debaters. Cross-examination can be very important, and debate rounds, in fact, can be won and lost in cross-examination, okay? So, when you are asking and answering these questions, you have to be aware of how important these things are. So don't just ask a question that you have no reason to ask. There should always be some motivation behind asking a question. When you're answering questions, now I wouldn't ever encourage you to lie about your position or lie about your evidence or anything like that. But when you are answering questions, try and answer those questions while thinking about what is it that my opponent is trying to do. Are they just asking to clarify so that I can explain my position? Or are they trying to get me to admit to something I don't want to admit to? Okay. This is really where that part of debate that is persuasion, that is appealing to the judge and getting the judge to like you, can come into play. Because this is really where you are thinking on your feet.
This is where having read those articles is really helpful, because you can use them to help you make questions before you even get to cross-examination. So if you know, everyone knows what everyone else's plan is, because it's the same thing for everybody, right? So you can tonight be thinking, okay, well, this article says the sky is blue. I'm going to ask a question if the sky, that's a really bad example, but you can base questions off of information out of those articles, even if the affirmative doesn't say anything about it. That way you can kind of start finding the holes to point out to the judge before you even have a constructive speech to give. Does this make sense? So it can be really good when the 2N is asking in cross-ex. They can start here before their partner has said anything, right? To make the judge already start doubting that this is a good idea. Okay? So like Jake's saying, it's not just like prep time for your partner. It's also that first chance that you get to make your opponents not seem like such a good idea. Okay? And that's why Jake's right. You don't want to ask pointless questions. Like on this topic is asking Jake, so Jake's the affirmative and I'm the negative. If I ask Jake, hey Jake, what color is the sky outside?
Blue.
Does that get me anything in the round? Does asking Jake what color the sky is matter? No. But if I ask Jake, let's say Jake read the marine ecosystems advantage, okay? He read the water advantage. And I say, Jake, are GMOs the only reason that water is contaminated and getting worse?
I would say they are the most significant reason, but no.
So what does that question do for me? Asking Jake if they're the only reason that water is getting worse. How does that help me? What do you think?
Jake's opinion, opinion is not so important.
Yeah, one of the reasons is Jake saying, yeah, I think they're the most important. Okay, so that's one reason. So you can use your evidence that says water's not contaminated by GMOs to be like, see, I have a professor or someone that says it that knows more than Jake does. Okay, so there's one. What's another reason that question's really good to ask?
Think of it this way. Okay, so with this water ecosystems advantage, I'm saying that because of the chemicals we use on GMOs, the water systems in Japan are being polluted and they're going to cause the ecosystems to collapse, right? That's the argument. And so I'm saying that if we ban GMOs in Japan, we can save these ecosystems. Well, Shanna gets me to admit in cross-examination that there are a bunch of other things that cause pollution in Japan's water. If I'm only banning GMOs, and there are all of these other causes, can I solve for water pollution in Japan?
If GMOs are not the only reason that water is contaminated, that water is going bad, but all plan does is ban GMOs, am I solving all of the other problems? No. Why am I not solving all the other problems, Shenli?
There are other methods for problems.
Right, and the case doesn't deal with those, right?
Good.
Exactly, great. So I've already started before my partner has said one word to show that Jake's plan is not as great as he makes it seem, right?
So these types of questions are what you should be aiming to do in cross-examination, all right? If you are the person who's asking questions, you have two jobs. Your first job is to make sure that you understand your opponent's arguments. Get clarification. Make sure that everything that your opponent said during their speech makes sense to you. Because if you don't understand it, how can you answer those? How can you or your partner answer those arguments? You can't do it very well. So you make sure that you understand what your opponent has just said. However, once you are confident that you understand your opponent's arguments and you have cross-examination time still left, that is when you start trying to get your opponent to make these admissions, to agree that yes, maybe my plan doesn't solve everything, or yes, maybe there are other factors that could cause my disadvantage to happen, okay? In this way, after you are done asking questions for clarification, you need to have a specific agenda, a plan of ways that you can make your opponent's arguments look bad. Okay? Do you follow me? So, in this way, after you have asked these questions and feel confident that you understand your opponent's arguments, don't ask questions that you don't know the answer to. Shanna, in this example, knows that there are other things that pollute the ecosystems in Japan, right? But she asks me anyway, because she knows that I can't lie. She asks me, she makes me say it, because me admitting that my plan isn't that great, as opposed to her making those arguments, seems so much worse for the affirmative. Do you see how that works? Okay.
Would you like beating without breath?
Yes. If Shanna is, of course, throughout the debate, going to make arguments about why the affirmative plan doesn't solve, right? If she's negative. But if in cross-examination, she can get me, the affirmative speaker, to say, you're right, the affirmative plan doesn't solve the problems, how can the judge vote for me? Because if the affirmative is saying that the affirmative can't solve, why should the judge vote affirmative? Yep. Good. So, that is the purpose of cross-examination. One, to get clarification, and 2, to get your opponent to admit to problems with their arguments.
The one thing on clarification is remember you're a team. So if you're asking the questions, but your partner needs you to, like, say you understand it and you completely get it, but your partner who's has to give the speech next doesn't understand something, you need to ask them to explain it so your partner can hear. Okay? So if Dr. Z were my partner, okay, we're partners, we're the negative. Jake has just given the affirmative. I understand it. I get it. I know what he's doing. Dr. Z leans over and goes, I don't get the advantage. Can you please ask him to explain it? I say, of course, Dr. Z, I can do that for you. And so I would ask Jake, I would say, Jake, can you please explain your advantage to me? And then Dr. Z would be able to sit there and listen and go, oh, so it's not all just about you understanding. You have to make sure your partner understands as well.
That's especially important because, as we talked about yesterday, say that they are partners on the negative. I've just given the first affirmative constructive speech. Shanna is the second negative speaker, and Dr. Z is the first negative speaker. Shanna is asking questions, but Dr. Z is the person who gives the next speech. So it's more important in this moment for Dr. Z to understand what's going on.
Than
Okay.
it is for me
Right.
to start finding holes.
Right.
Because we still have 2 full speeches that we can point out those holes.
Right.
But if my partner doesn't understand the speech, doesn't know what's going on, they can't point out holes or say why something doesn't solve because they don't understand it.
So, when you are debating, if you are the partner who is about to speak next, so it's your partner who is about to ask questions, make sure that you ask your partner to clarify anything that you don't understand. Okay?
Like before we would be sitting next to each other. Before I even stood up, I would look at Dr. Z and I would say, do you have any questions you want me to ask?
Yes, could you have them explain the advantage?
Yes. I would stand up, walk over here, and that would be my very first question that I would ask. Okay?
So, here's another issue with cross-examination that is very important to understand. Okay, we're going to go back to our earlier example, okay? I'm affirmative, and I have this water advantage, and Shanna's negative. Shanna gets me to say in cross-examination that there are all of these other causes to water pollution, okay? Now let's pretend that, okay, that happens in this cross-examination, but Dr. Z does not talk about it in this speech. Shanna does not talk about that in this speech. Dr. Z does not talk about it in this speech. Nobody brings it up until Shanna mentions it. It is the last speech for the negative in the round, and Shanna says, by the way, remember in cross-examination when Jake said that his own plan can't solve for all of water pollution. It is too late at this point, okay? Cross-examination is important for getting these arguments out there, but your judge cannot vote on things that come out in cross-examination. You need to say these things in your speeches as well, okay? Just having it out in cross-examination isn't enough. So often, and I was very guilty of this when I would first start debating, is I would ask great cross-examination questions and made my opponents look terrible. But I wouldn't say anything about it until the very end of the debate round, and at that point it is just too late. You need to mention it in a speech, and more importantly, you need to mention it in a constructive speech.
Because remember, we can't make any new arguments in a rebuttal. Now, since Z and I are partners. He's preparing for his speech while I'm asking Jake questions, okay? I asked Jake this great question of, do other things cause water pollution? And he admitted to me yes. But Dr. Z was doing what you're supposed to be doing when you're prepping, and he's focused. Now that he understands everything, he is focused on what he has to do, so he's not really listening to me, right? This is where you remember how much you get prep time? This is where you'd want to use a little bit of it. So you could sit down with your partner and go, when you talk about their case, I asked them if other things cause water pollution, and he told me yes. Make sure you remind the judge of that. Okay? And so Dr. Z would be able to go to his notes, go to that advantage, and he'd be able to write down, a note to himself about that happened. So that's why prep time is really good, because you can tell your partner I can tell Dr. Z what Jake admitted to me, but Dr. Z didn't have to sit there through the whole 3 minutes and just stare at us and listen. He was able to use that 3 minutes also for prep time.
This proves another example of something that is very important to remember about policy debate, is that even though only one person for a team is speaking at a time or involved in cross-examination at a time, it is a team activity. And you and your partner need to work together and rely on each other in order to do well. The two of you need to be talking during prep time to make sure that you are thinking in the same way about how you want to approach the round. Okay?
Remember that you win together and you lose together. Not just one of you wins. You both have to win. So if you and your partner, so let's say Dr. Z and I are partners, and we're not getting along, and we're fighting, and we don't agree on what to run. So in the 1NC, he runs a bunch of arguments, and then I get up for the 2NC, and I run a whole new set of completely new arguments that didn't have nothing to do with what he said, because I don't think he made smart arguments. Do we look good as a team? Dr. Z always makes smart arguments for the purposes of the example. But would we look good as a team? As a judge, would you think that we would be a good option to vote for, since we're not working together and we're not making sure we have the same story? Or Jake and his partner, who are getting along really well, are working together in prep time, are telling the same story, would they look like a better choice to vote for? Exactly. So you don't want to, even if you don't agree with them, be nice about it. Don't, yeah. But yeah, so you gotta work. That's the story. Together.
Do you have any questions so far about cross-examination? While you are asking questions, there are a couple of strategies that you can use to your advantage. Now, often when teams are asking questions, you are referring to pieces of evidence, okay? If say that your opponents read a piece of evidence that is really terrible, or maybe even a lie. We've talked to you about how you have to watch out for people who have evidence that say GMOs do not affect your health, and then make the evidence say GMOs do affect your health. Well, there is one thing that you can do if you notice that this is happening with your opponent's evidence. You can read their evidence aloud during cross-examination, and then ask them to explain it to you. So for example, if Shanna read this piece of evidence that said GMOs do cause health problems, but really what the evidence actually says is GMOs do not cause health problems, I could read that aloud and ask her to explain why she presented the evidence that way.
Because, and the reason you can do that is because Jake, you all have the same evidence, right? if you were at a tournament, everyone would not have the same evidence, okay? So what you would do is Jake's first, so I finished my speech. Jake's very first question in cross-ex is, may I see a copy of all of your evidence? And I say, of course. And I hand him all of my evidence. So now he can read it all. Okay? Because I'm not hiding anything, right? If I've cut all of my evidence and kept it all meaning the same thing, I should have nothing to hide, so I should be able to give it to him so he can look at it. But I did lie. I said that GMOs do cause health problems, when the card actually says do not. So Jake would read the whole sentence, and I would be in a pickle. Problem.
Or another example, if we wanted to use the example we were using earlier about the water and how there are other causes to water pollution in Japan, if the evidence as I read it said that GMOs are a major cause of water pollution in Japan, and that is the line of my evidence that I read to you. Right after that, the article that I'm using as evidence, even if I'm not reading it in the round, maybe the rest of the article says other causes are
I could read this
overfishing.
off.
Does it actually do
Yeah.
that? Oh, okay.
Okay, so Jake read, if you look in your evidence packet, the B card for the Marine Ecosystems Advantage. So we're gonna go back to Jake's affirmative, I'm negative, okay? So we're on the B card, I've asked him for his evidence and I'm reading it, okay? It's the B card on the Marine Advantage, the Marine Ecosystems Advantage. And I would sit here and I go, okay, Jake, you didn't read this, but the card says the issue of water contamination is only part of the pollution problem. If it's only part of the pollution problem, how are you solving the problem?
Okay.
Does this make sense? He didn't read that. It's teeny tiny little print, but it's still in his card.
So it's important to read your opponent's evidence and, if you can, use it against them in cross-examination. Okay? Do you see how you can do this to make your opponents look bad in cross-examination, to make their arguments look weak?
Yesterday, Yaya was reading the evidence really closely, and she was coming up to us and going, the evidence says this, but the evidence says this, and we're like, yes, exactly. So if you know ahead of time and you read tonight, you can start coming up with questions tonight and kind of write them down on a piece of paper and have them with you for tomorrow, so that you can say, well, the evidence also says this, so how do you fix it? Or something like that, where you can use their evidence against them.
What you will probably notice from looking at this is that since all of you give a constructive speech, all of you, at some point in a debate round, will be the person answering cross-examination questions. Okay? Also, because of this order, you'll see that you will also have one opportunity to ask cross-examination questions. And so at this point, we're going to talk about some different tips for you to use as both the person who's asking questions, and then we'll talk about if you're the one who's answering questions. What can you do to make cross-examination more helpful? Okay? So, if you are the person who's asking questions, again, remember, the first thing you need to do is make sure you understand your opponent's arguments. Okay? Second, you need to try and ask questions that expose the weaknesses of your opponent's arguments. So when you do that, you don't want them to be able to wiggle out of your questions. You don't want them to be able to explain away these weaknesses. So to do that, try not to ask open-ended questions. By that I mean, don't ask questions like, why does your plan solve all of water pollution? Or why does your plan solve water pollution if there are these other causes? Because if Shanna asked me that, then I could have the opportunity as the person who's answering questions to be like, well, GMO herbicides are the major cause of water pollution, and if we get rid of that, I can offer this big explanation about why we still solve. And
Can't ask any other questions because he's blabbering on.
right? Instead, try to keep your opponent on track and try and trap them by asking yes or no questions. So the other version of that question that Shanna should ask is, if there are all these other causes to water pollution, can you solve water pollution just by banning GMOs? And how do I have to answer? I have to say no, right?
There's 2 words he can choose from. Yes, no.
So, if you are the person asking questions and you are done getting clarification, try and phrase your questions as yes or no questions.
And that's why I'm saying think about it a little bit tonight and write them down so you're not having to stand up here and think about them, but you can have them already ready to go.
Right. And that's why, along with that, along with making sure that you ask your opponents yes or no questions, make sure that your questions are very straightforward, very clear and to the point. Because the more vague your question is, the more your opponent can offer explanations. Right? You don't want explanations from your opponent, you want them to admit to problems. And you do that through yes or no questions that are very specific. Okay? Next is, if you are debating against someone like me, and you are asking me questions, I want to blabber away and explain my case again. I want to take up all of your cross-examination time by talking about why my plan is the best idea you've ever heard. If you're the person who's asking questions, you need to keep your opponent from doing that. Now, you don't ever want to be rude in cross-examination, but once your opponent has answered your question, just say, yes, okay, thank you, I have another question. Don't be afraid, don't let your opponent steal all of your time. It is your cross-examination. You're the person who gets to ask questions, okay? So if they have answered your question and you are satisfied, you move on. Be like, okay, thank you, I have another question, and then ask it, all right? At some point, though, if your opponent is babbling away and you are trying to get them to answer one question and they just won't do it, don't waste all of your cross-examination time trying to pin down the answer to this one question, okay? Chances are you have a lot of things you want to ask. And if your opponent is being really stubborn and won't answer your question, at some point, they're the person who is going to look bad to the judge because they won't answer your question. You need to realize when you are not going to get that answer that you want and move on, okay? At some point, you have to realize that this isn't helping me anymore. I need to ask other questions. Right? It's sometimes it's tricky to recognize that, and sometimes I know for me, I get stubborn too when I'm asking questions, and I want the answer. But you have to recognize I'm not learning anything. I'm not helping myself out by asking this question over and over again. So I need to move on. Okay?
And if you get frustrated, it just makes the round even more difficult. So just let it go. Like, okay, my next question. And if you're calmer, you look like you're the better choice to vote for, right?
Like I said at the beginning of this particular session, a lot of cross-examination is about that perception to the judge, making yourself look confident and knowledgeable and organized. So the more you can do that and make your opponent look bad, the better. Okay. The last tip I have for you here, if you're the person who's asking questions, is don't just ask about one of your opponent's positions. Okay? Say I'm asking questions after the first affirmative constructive. If Shanna is the first affirmative speaker and she presented the case and she read 2 different advantages, okay? Pretend she read the marine ecosystems advantage and the small farms advantage. I don't want to spend my entire cross-examination asking about just the small farms advantage, okay? Ask questions about all the positions. The other side of cross-examination then, of course, is being the person who's answering. Now, it's really easy in this position, especially once your opponent starts asking those yes or no questions, to get flustered, to get nervous, because your opponent is attacking your case in cross-examination. But you need to remember, before all things, stay calm, all right? Be together, make sure that you know your case. Remember that you know your evidence really, really well, okay? And be prepared to defend it. Remember that you'll have good evidence. You wouldn't waste time creating bad evidence, would you? You shouldn't. You have good evidence, and you can stand up for it. So don't let your opponent ever make you feel flustered.
If you don't understand the question they ask you, ask them if they could repeat it, ask it differently. If they use words you're not understanding, say, what do you mean by that? I don't understand. If you stay calm and let the judge know that you don't understand what they're asking, there's a chance the judge didn't understand the question either. So having them repeat it doesn't make you look bad. It makes you look more confident that you are willing to make sure that you're giving the correct answer instead of guessing. It shows that you are very focused at what's going on. There's been times where I've had to ask someone to repeat a question 3 or 4 times because my brain was just not understanding it. And that's perfectly okay.
Right. And it might not be your fault. Maybe it's their fault for asking the question poorly, okay? It could be maybe both, but make sure that you are on the same page with each other. It's okay to tell your opponent, I don't understand what you're asking. The next thing is, now we talked about how if you're the person who's asking questions, you want to keep your opponent to quick responses, try and keep their explanations to a minimum. Well, if you're the person who's answering questions, you want to try and explain as much as possible. It's usually bad, it's usually bad for you if they are asking questions, right? Because they're trying to set up arguments. So if you take up more cross-examination time, that means that they have less opportunity to set up those arguments. So take that time to try as much as you can to explain. Now, again, you don't want to be rude. So if your opponent is saying things, okay, thank you, I'd like to ask another question, don't just keep talking. Move on, don't be a jerk, but it is okay to try and explain. So for example, if Shannon were to ask me, if there are all these other causes to water pollution, can your case solve all of water pollution? She wants me to just say no, right? Well, for my position, I can be polite and say no. I can say, but you want to follow that up with a but statement or a because statement. No, we can't solve all of water pollution, but we can solve the biggest contributor to water pollution, is what I would say. Does that make sense? Offer an explanation. Okay.
And then, if say your opponent's just standing there not saying anything, you can say, remember, my case told you, and you can keep talking. If your opponent's just going to stand there and not say anything and just, why stand there quietly? That's time where you can be, I am the best thing in the world. I'm the best thing since sliced bread. You want
Or rice.
Well, you don't slice rice.
Well, no, the best thing since rice.
Oh yeah, the best thing since rice. I am. But yeah, keep talking. Don't just stand there. Sell yourself.
Right. Never just say yes or no. It's yes because, no, because, or in this example, no, we don't solve all of water pollution, but we sure solve a lot of water pollution, and here's why. Okay? So, all right. Do you have any questions about answering questions in cross-examination? The best thing that you can do to prepare yourself for cross-examination and to be asked questions is be familiar with your evidence. Okay? Read your case over and over again. Evidence that you like to use, make sure you know who your authors are. Okay? Make sure you understand the claims that they're making and why. Right? Just know your case. It's the best thing you can do is read and read and read your positions. Any questions that you can think of so far? Yes.
Should we use easy words instead of using technical words on these articles? When I prepare for first affirmative speech,
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?
should we use easy words instead of using technical difficult words?
Yeah.
This material.
Yes. You can change, like, as far as like the taglines are, you can change those words as much as you want, as long as they are still, as long as you're not changing what the evidence says. Okay. But you can, if you don't like the way we phrased one of the taglines, or one of the ways that we've explained a piece of evidence, you can change it to explain it in a way that you prefer. That's easier for you.
Thank you very
Yep,
much.
of course.
And you two are preparing in another room. I think I told everyone else. If you're looking at a piece of evidence and you think it's too long for you, you are more than welcome to take a highlighter and highlight what you think is most important, and that be what you read. As long as it's not changing the meaning, you can make cards shorter if you want to, and that's perfectly okay. Jake and I are used to longer speeches, and we can speak faster, obviously. So we tried to cut them short, but most of them can be cut even shorter. And I think I was telling these two here that I always am constantly recutting evidence and changing words, like for my taglines. I'll do it from day one of making a case to the very last round that I have is the affirmative. I'll change something. So it's not a big deal at all. You won't hurt our feelings at all.
So before we go to another exercise, we do have a couple other suggestions for cross-examination, no matter if you are the person who's asking or the person who's answering questions. The first is, like we've said, cross-examination is as much for the judge as it is for the two debaters, right? Because you want the judge to catch arguments as well, catch admissions that you get your opponents to admit to, or if you ask a question for clarification. Your judge could probably use that clarification too. So, even though you are talking to the person who is doing cross-examination with you, so say, for example, that Shanna and I are opponents, and I'm asking her cross-examination questions. Even though we're the people who are talking to each other, we face the judge, okay? The judge who's sitting probably right here, where Koki is. We want to face the judge and talk to the judge. Does that make sense? Even though you are interacting with each other, face the judge.
The reason is because you want the judge to see your face. Because say I ask Jake the question about the water, and I'm negative and Jake's affirmative, and I say, Jake, if there's other causes to water pollution, do you solve all of water pollution? And Jake responds, and while Jake's talking, just say something.
Okay.
Answer them yes.
Yes, of course, we solve the biggest cause to water pollution because GMO herbicides are the biggest contributor to water sources because the chemicals go into streams and underground
But
water
Jake,
sources.
you told me earlier that there are other sources of water pollution. How are you solving those?
We don't claim to get rid of all sources of water pollution, but we claim to get rid of the most dangerous and most significant cause of water pollution.
My face, right? My face gives away that I'm like, really? If I do it this way though, and I'm talking to Jake like this, and I'm making my face, I'm like, to Jake, you can't see that, right? The judge can't see it. So you want the judge, you want to be able to use your face also. And you want the judge to see it. You don't care if they see your face. Jake sees me all the time, right? You see each other all the time. The judge is who you want to see you.
Now, the biggest part of cross-examination, the biggest advice I can give you is that it is very easy for cross-examination to get heated, meaning that you can start argument like a fight in cross-examination. You don't want that to happen. That makes both debaters look bad, okay? You can be confident and you can ask strong questions and you can make strong arguments in cross-examination without being mean, right? You want to be confident. You want to be assertive, but you don't want to be a jerk. You don't want to be aggressive, okay? Do you understand the difference? Sometimes it's hard to not go into that world, but you need to remember that this is an activity about persuasion and presentation, and you don't want your judge to think that you're a jerk. Now, at the same time, a lot of us are very good at being nice people and being confident and being friendly and presentational. This was a big issue for me. I very rarely would start being a jerk in cross-examination, but sometimes it's hard if the person who's asking you questions is a jerk to not respond the same way. It's hard to not get angry if somebody's being a jerk to you. If somebody's being a jerk to you, you'll probably feel it. You'll probably get angry. It's important to keep yourself under control. Don't get over emotional. Remember where you are. Remember that this is about the debate round and about the arguments and about the judge, not about how much of a jerk your opponent is. So don't let your opponent make you upset. Right?
And if your opponent's being a jerk, and you stay calm, and then you win the round, how much better do you get to feel of, see, look, I remained calm. Look what that did for me. You got all heated, and you lost the round. I mean, you wouldn't say that to them, but you can have that feeling of a big accomplishment.
All of you seem like absolutely wonderful people, and very nice, very friendly. So I don't think that this is going to be a problem for us tomorrow when we have these debates. But this is just a good rule to remember when you're in a debate round and you're interacting with people. Things can get angry and emotional very quickly, so you have to keep yourself under control, okay? Now, the last big tip I have two more big tips for you. Sometimes you come up in cross-examination if you're the person who's asking questions and you have a list of things that you want to ask. Maybe, though, while your opponent is explaining or answering a question, you'll come up with something new. Don't be afraid to ask that question. You don't have to stick to your list of pre-prepared questions. If you think of something new and you think it's a good question, use it. Absolutely. That's what cross-examination is for. Cross-examination is a lot of fun. I think it's really exciting because it's really thinking on your feet. So if you think of a new question, use it. Okay? Maybe your opponent will say something in such a way that it makes you think of a new argument that you can make. Well, you don't want to lose that opportunity, so ask the question. Right? The last thing that I will tell you is remember, when you are asking questions in cross-examination, your partner is preparing to give a speech, right? So, even if you run out of questions that you want to ask, say, cross-examination is 3 minutes long, and after 1 minute, you're done asking questions. Well, you don't want to sit down and end cross-examination because that means your partner loses 2 minutes of free prep time. So, even if you don't necessarily care, even if you know the answer to the questions that you're about to ask your opponent, will you please explain why you solve again? Will you please explain the impact to your advantage? Explain what your plan does. Ask questions for clarification, because that way you are using that cross-examination time and your partner gets to continue to prepare.
And you never know, the next time that they re-explain it to you, maybe you'll come up with that new question, and that new question could end up winning you the round, right? Like it could be a great thought that you have that ends up being the round winner. So it's also prep time for your brain to be working while they're answering as well. Okay. Cross-X is one of my favorite things. I love it.
Yes.
Hated it when I started, love it now.
Once you get into debate, I promise you, cross-examination will be one of those things that you really look forward to. I loved being asked questions in cross-examination. It was so much fun, okay? Because that is your opportunity to really explain your case. Or if you're asking questions, that's your opportunity to interact with your opponent for the first time and make their arguments look bad. Or, more specifically, make your opponents make their own arguments look bad, because they're the ones who are answering. So cross-examination is very, very important and a lot of fun. Just don't be nervous about it, and most importantly, don't let yourself get angry.